Edgerton. You star in Loving as Richard Loving, whose interracial marriage leads to a Supreme Court case in the United States. You're an Australian actor, of course, and this is a significant part of American history, this story. So how much of anything did you know about this story before you took the role?
I didn't know anything about it at all. I mean, I was working with Jeff Nichols on Midnight Special, which we had shot in New Orleans. And then towards the end of that shoot, he asked me about the possibility of working with him again, which was on The Loving Story. And I knew nothing about Richard and Mildred. He shared a documentary with me called The Loving Story by Nancy Bursky. And that was the first I knew about them. And I was kind of shocked that not very many Americans knew about Richard and Mildred too. I felt like I was off the hook because I was Australian. But, you know, when I did some thinking about it and a lot of research leading up to making the movie, I feel like the reason a lot of people didn't really know about this story was because, you know, we're talking about a 9-year period of time where a couple get married and then endure all these obstacles, including being in prison and being exiled. But before they were allowed to legitimately be seen as man and wife under the law, that was a 9-year slow, oppressive period that really wasn't marked by any kind of singular newsworthy event. It wasn't bloodshed. No one was assassinated, and so for that reason, I think there's a perceived gentleness to the story that didn't make it, you know, on the 6 o'clock news, and therefore it's somewhat been forgotten about. But it's a couple who through their steadfast, determined nature, changed the Constitution of the United States. So, you know, it's a big story. It's a loud story, even though it seems quite small and quiet.
Does making a fact-based film like this affect how you approach it? Like, is there more pressure to do it justice when you're dealing with real people and real circumstances?
Yeah, there is. I mean, you know, I do like to draw, and sometimes if you stare at a blank page and you know the possibilities you can create anything, that's sort of freeing on one hand, but it's also limiting because you spend so much time going, all right, what am I going to draw? When someone tells you specifically what to do and what to draw, it narrows the field of possibilities, and then you can get very particular about things. And in many ways, being given the job of playing a character who really existed narrowed that field of possibilities. It means you're not just creating anything. You are being so specific about studying a person if you are lucky enough, like we did, to have archival footage of them. The fear is, though, you put too much pressure on yourself to you know, get all the aspects right. You know, and you want to make sure that the portrayal of the characters doesn't just become an impression of them, or you know, like a mimicry of what you think they were like, and that you got to go in beyond that and still service the movie.
As you mentioned, the film was inspired by the documentary "The Loving Story," and we do have archival footage of this couple. Was that your primary way to sort of get into the mindset and the personality of Richard? Did you have any other sources that you were able to tap into to try and inhabit this role?
I think, you know, the majority of it was the archival footage, because we could, you know, watch them walk and move and sit down and talk to each other, and, you know, so getting the accent and the sounds of the voice and the posture and all that was predominantly from the documentary, and watching them interact with their children and doing domestic duties around the house, and also the relationship as it seemed to exist between the two of them, like that feeling between the two of them, which was almost more important than creating the character. But there were a lot of thinking around the idea of you know, emasculation for me. I think, you know, for Richard, it was a big question of him being emasculated by the situation. There's also a lot of thinking about the silence in the film and why it seemed in the documentary particularly that Richard was so uh, inarticulate, and not just inarticulate, but just quiet and silent, and thinking a lot more than he spoke. And then meeting his daughter was interesting. Added some different dimensions to it too, because when you watch the archival footage there, of course, under the scrutiny of being filmed, which to them, that Richard never felt like he was the sort of person that you put on TV or you put in news. So his shyness was amplified by having cameras in his house. Gray Villette's photographs were a huge clue to us to more intimate moments, because he somehow managed to become a fly on the wall in a way that the documentary crew couldn't. And Richard and Mildred allowed themselves to be quite intimate in photographs that he took. So, look, it was a jumble of different, things.
And you mentioned that this sense of emasculation that Richard feels. It does really seem like a big part of his struggle is not just what's being done to him and his wife by Virginia, but him as a husband and a provider and a father isn't able to necessarily stop it or to fix it. How did that inform your entire kind of perception of this character and your entire playing of this role? Was that a really central feature?
Yeah, it was very clear that Mildred was the real strength of the relationship in terms of that period of time after the marriage when they were kind of their options were shut down. They were given the option of annulling their marriage or going to jail or going and living somewhere outside the state of Virginia. And they I think Richard's take was just to do whatever was necessary as long as he could stay married to Mildred. But there was no sense of any option of debating the issue or arguing the issue or fighting against the law. Mildred was the one who was looking for a way around the issue, knowing that it wouldn't just the problem wouldn't just go away. But there's something. There was something about approaching the character for me was about not trying to understand the law or any of the laws that were in question in terms of limiting their legitimacy of their marriage. Because Richard really just didn't understand the law. And I think that was part of his frustration is, not only did he feel like he wasn't the sort of person that you put on TV or on the news, he didn't feel like he could argue with or be in the same room as lawyers and people that wore suits and talked about such things, because he didn't understand it. It's kind of like for me when I sit down with people who talk about accountancy and money, I suddenly stop listening. You know what I mean? Like I feel I may as well be listening to a different language. And when a person comes up against something that they don't quite understand, even though it's vital to their own existence, I think there's a tendency to kind of switch off and look for an escape. And I think that was very much Richard. I don't think he felt like he could talk about such matters, and he certainly didn't understand them. He had a more kind of human approach, which was just like, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why shouldn't I just be able to do what I'm doing? And instead of going through all this spending of money and moving up the chain toward the Supreme Court, he felt like he could swim in a path of least resistance in the other direction of just going, well, just let them all know we're not hurting people. And there's something beautiful about that.
And Richard and Mildred, of course, are no longer with us, but they do have a surviving daughter, Peggy. Did you have a chance to work closely with her or get reactions from her after the fact, or what was that like, having her see this film about her family and her parents?
Working backwards, Peggy was at the New York premiere. She's thrilled with the movie. I think she's very happy with what Jeff's done, but I first met her in Richmond right at the beginning of shooting, and it was quite a nerve-wracking thing. She's you know, when you watch the documentary newsreel footage, she is so like just a very spirited little girl. She's hamming it up for the cameras. You know, I guess like Richard and Mildred, she'd never really been filmed before, so she was like, you know, just jumping in front of the camera and playing. And now she's grown into a woman who's very much like energetically like her father. She's very reserved, doesn't speak a lot. But you know, by the very little she does say, you know, that we had her blessing, you know, that she was happy with what was going on. And you know, she told me a couple of things that were very kind of vital to that whole building of the character as well. And she gave us the other half of the picture, I guess, in saying things like there was a lot of laughter in their house, and that she remembers her father having a great sense of humor, and she'd heard that from other people because she was very young when he passed away. So, you know, there was something about her presence that was enough. She wasn't there advising so much. It was more that she was there and she was okay with us telling the story.
The relationship that you develop between Richard and Mildred in this film feels very lived in. Did you have a lot of time to work together with Ruth Negga, your co-star, before you started shooting, or rehearsal time, or how did you develop that really kind of close, detailed relationship?
Well, I think there was a couple of things. We went to Virginia early, like a couple of, maybe a month and a half before we started shooting. We spent 2 weeks in Virginia, and you know, Jeff took us on a bit of a tour of the places that Richard and Mildred had lived. The courthouse, which we shot in, where they had first been tried, in Bowling Green, and also the jail that they had been in. And we went and visited the gravesite where Richard and Mildred were buried side by side. And all of that experience and hanging out with Ruth during that time, and understanding, I think, during that time of how important a task we had, you know, to tell their story and do it well and do it truthfully, and how much of a privilege it was, and that I think we both felt like we were doing something really important together, and we just really liked each other. And you know, I think she you know, it was very clear that she was going to do an amazing job, and once we started shooting, that was very clear. So I had a lot of respect for what she could do as well in front of the camera. But yeah, I mean, I think it was the fact that we felt like the lucky ones who got to do it that brought us together.
You mentioned you know, the film, of course, is directed by Jeff Nichols, and you mentioned that you'd worked with him previously on Midnight Special, which sort of on the surface is a completely different kind of film. Of course, it's a science fiction film, and this is a fact-based drama. But I mean, they're both ultimately kind of these intimate stories about family. So was it a very similar experience or different experience working on these two different films with Jeff Nichols?
It feels a little similar. I mean, I felt like with Loving, we always felt like we knew where the source was coming from. Like we knew exactly the world, and, you know, because Midnight Special has a science fiction element to it that's a creation of his mind, which I think is a wonderful movie. But Loving was a different thing. It felt like Loving was slightly more special in its own way because of the story it was and the truth of the story. But the whole methodology of making the films is the same. As Jeff, I think you're right. All of his stories really are about family, and Midnight Special is as much about love as Loving is. You know, so it feels like a similar process. And most of his films are shot out in very rural areas too. So, you know, there's a nice open space to wherever you tend to be shooting, in beautiful places. New Orleans, when we were shooting, was supremely cold though, so it was nice to be in Richmond and in the warmth and out there in the farms and stuff. It was a good feeling.
You're a writer and director yourself. You made a feature film, The Gift, that you wrote and directed last year. Does that kind of, having that experience and having that viewpoint creatively influence your work as an actor, or make it easier to relate with other directors in a way?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think part of the reason, I think everything feeds everything else, like part of the reason I think I was even able to direct a movie is because of the experiences I've had as an actor, watching other directors work, reading screenplays, makes me, I think, a better writer. And then hopefully being a director gives me more understanding what it really means to be an actor on a technical level. And so I think each experience sort of, you build on each experience, and it helps with all aspects. I feel like I felt very relieved to go to work after making The Gift and go shoot Loving, where all I had to do was concentrate on my role as an actor. But it definitely filled me up with other information directing, where I had a full empathetic experience to every aspect of the movie and everybody's role within a movie, and understanding very clearly how much work goes into everybody's jobs before an actor turns up to take all the glory.
Does directing and writing, do those satisfy a different kind of creative impulse in you, than acting does, or is it all kind of part of the same kind of drive to kind of be a storyteller?
I think I get a little bit more satisfaction out of writing and directing. It's more frustrating, and there's more responsibility. And I always say that being a director and being an actor are different, because when you're an actor, you're basically employed to be a child, and you can behave like one, and you only really have one job. And but you can be a child as in like that, you sort of lack responsibility for so many things, and you could just you're supposed to let go. And being a director is like being a grown-up, because you're responsible for everything. But they're both fun, and I will say that as an actor, I may experience like 5 minutes or 10 minutes of a day where I feel like, it's all been worthwhile and I'm doing the right thing with my life. But you sit around waiting a lot and wondering what's happening, and when's someone going to tell me what to do and pull me out of my box to perform. Whereas, being a director, I think from the moment I got up in the morning to the moment I hit the pillow in the evening, I was constantly solving problems or thinking about how to get things achieved, which is exhausting, but it's a good exhaustion. So I'll do it again, but I'm kind of glad I can, do a bit of both. I'm not, every time I go and make a movie, I don't have to be responsible for everything.
Well, I want to congratulate you again on Loving and Midnight Special earlier this year, and best of luck with your future acting, writing, and directing projects.
Thank you very much.